Neville Goddard often summarized his position with a phrase that appears absolute. When you feel this way, it cannot fail. In his usage, this was not a claim about external guarantees, but a description of an inner psychological condition. He was referring to a specific quality of feeling in which an outcome is no longer entertained as possible, hoped for or awaited, but is accepted as already established in consciousness. In this state, the mind no longer relates to the desired condition as uncertain or future-bound. It relates to it as fact. You are asked to notice the difference between hoping and inward certainty. Hope still contains contingency. It allows for alternatives. The feeling Neville describes excludes that contingency. It is the sense that the matter is settled internally. In his model, it cannot fail names the absence of inner oscillation, not the presence of emotional intensity. The unresolved question is whether the mind can recognize this sense of inevitability without confusing it with confidence, excitement, or reassurance. For this model to function, a prior assumption must be in place that certainty originates in consciousness before it appears as circumstance. Neville treats awareness as the primary arena in which done or not done is first decided. External situations, in this view, do not create conviction. They reflect it. From a third-person perspective, the system assumes that states of consciousness precede and organize experience. From a second-person perspective, you are invited to examine how the sense of settled arises before any sensory confirmation. When you feel certain, the feeling is not produced by future outcomes. It is generated internally. The tension lies in whether this ordering can be maintained without reverting to the ordinary intuition that certainty must be granted by events rather than by awareness itself. Within this framework, feeling functions as the acceptance of reality status. Neville does not use the word to mean emotion or mood. He uses it to mean the sense that something is rather than may be. Cognitively, it marks the transition from hypothetical representation to assumed fact. You can observe this shift in ordinary thought. When a possibility is still under consideration, it carries the quality of maybe. When it is accepted, that quality changes to is. Neville identifies this change as feeling. It is the moment a state is no longer entertained but inhabited. The psychological mechanism is not persuasion or repetition of ideas, but the relocation of the self within a particular reference point. The unresolved issue is whether this acceptance can be clearly distinguished from expectation, which still looks forward, or from emotional reassurance, which seeks comfort rather than reality. Status. Imagination, in Neville's model, is the instrument through which present reality sense is established. He does not define it as fantasy or decoration, but as the mind's capacity to experience a state as current thought from an analytical standpoint. Imagination functions as cognitive simulation. It allows a situation to be experienced in first-person terms, even when it is not yet present in the sensory field. From a second-person standpoint, you can notice that imagined scenes can carry different degrees of reality. Some are recognized as hypothetical, others are felt as already so. Feeling is the criterion that confers this status. The open question is whether the mind can sustain this present-tense acceptance without reverting to the habitual classification of imagined content as future or unreal. If a state is accepted as already real, then a specific internal logic follows. Perception, interpretation, and response organize themselves around that acceptance. In Neville's language, it cannot fail describes the internal coherence of this sequence. The model proposes a simple order: state first, experience second. When a reference point is all ready, attention selects information, interpretations, and actions consistent with that reference. This does not require external force. It requires consistency of inner position. The system remains coherent. as long as the assumed state is treated as primary and circumstances as secondary expressions. The unresolved question is whether this precedence can be directly observed in consciousness, or whether it is only inferred by looking back at how experiences align over time. Neville's emphasis on present certainty has clear historical continuity. Across many philosophical and psychological traditions, conviction has been described as a present condition rather than a future reward. Faith, certainty, and assurance have often been defined as states of mind that exist now, independent of sensory verification. What Neville does is translate this continuity into a cognitive framework. He removes doctrinal language and describes the process as one of assumption and feeling. From a neutral perspective, this may reflect the recurring pattern in how human cognition stabilizes belief. The tension remains whether such recurrence points to a universal structure of mind or simply to inherited ways of interpreting inner experience. Within this model, mental discipline is the stabilization of the assumed state. It is not the suppression of doubt by force, but the repeated return of attention to the reference of already. From a third-person view, discipline operates through regulation of inner speech and attentional habits. From a second-person view, you can observe how the mind naturally drifts toward contingency and how it can be brought back to the sense of completion. Each return reinforces the state as familiar. The open question is whether such stabilization can remain flexible, or whether it inevitably risks becoming rigid through over-control. Perception, in Neville's framework, is filtered through the assumed state. Experiences are not encountered as neutral data. They are interpreted in light of what is already taken to be true. When the reference is uncertainty, events are read as confirming or disconfirming. When the reference is inevitability, events are read as consistent expressions. This is not presented as distortion, but as organization. The mind selects, emphasizes, and integrates information according to its settled position. The unresolved tension is how to differentiate genuine reorganization of perception from reinterpretation that occurs only after outcomes are known. Agency is defined not as the ability to force results, but as the capacity to remain identified with a chosen state. Neville locates responsibility in the maintenance of inner position rather than in external manipulation. From an analytical standpoint, action follows identity. What you do, notice, and expect is structured by where you locate yourself psychologically. In this model, agency consists in consistency of self-location. The question is whether such agency can be sustained without reverting to outcome-driven effort, which would reintroduce the reference of not yet. The phrase, "when you feel this way, it cannot fail," requires semantic clarification. Feel refers to reality status, not emotion. Cannot fail refers to the absence of inner doubt, not to a prediction about events. Linguistically, the statement describes an internal condition of inevitability. It names a closed cognitive loop. Assumption accepted as fact, attention organized accordingly, and experience interpreted in line with that organization. The tension lies in whether this meaning can be maintained without slipping into literal expectations or promises. Taken as a whole, Neville Goddard's model forms a closed psychological structure. Consciousness is primary. Feeling assigns reality status. Assumption defines identity. Attention stabilizes the state. Perception and action follow from the settled reference. Understanding this system does not require affirmation or rejection. It requires seeing how its elements interlock and how it cannot fail functions as a description of inner coherence rather than as an external guarantee. The remaining question is whether the mind can rest in this structural understanding without converting it into belief, denial, or anticipation, and whether comprehension itself can remain a quiet observation of how the model is organized.